The stone wall of the east corridor didn't just crumble, it detonated inward, showering Barnaby Finch with pulverized mortar and the stinging heat of dark magic. He slammed backward against the floor, a jagged scream tearing from his throat as his left shin snapped clean across the bone. Through the choking dust, 3 silhouettes stepped over the rubble, their wands raised, the green light of the killing curse already gathering at the tips. Behind Barnaby, tucked into the shallow alcove of the tapestry room, 12 first years were sobbing, their terror so palpable it felt like a cold draught on his neck. He was the only thing standing between 3 fully trained Death Eaters and a massacre, and he was on the ground, unable to stand, with a wand that had always been a little too sluggish in a duel. He had maybe 4 seconds before the first curse hit him. His mind flashed to the only spell he had mastered perfectly this year.
The one everyone in the Hufflepuff common room had laughed at until they cried. The furniture-moving charm. The idiot spell for lazy house elves. It was suicide. It was ridiculous. But as the lead Death Eater laughed, a sound like grinding metal, Barnaby realized it was the only weapon he had left. If you want to know how this forgotten wizard turned a useless domestic charm into Hogwarts' last defense, stay with me until the end of this story. It was the night of May 2nd, 1998, and the castle was dying. Barnaby Finch shouldn't have been on the front lines. He was a 7th-year Hufflepuff with a reputation for being aggressively average. He had failed his defense against the dark arts twice, not because he lacked power, but because he panicked under pressure. While the Gryffindors were learning to cast Patronuses and the Ravenclaws were calculating arithmancy charts for shield wards,
Barnaby had spent his final year obsessed with utility charms to help the house elves move heavy trunks without scratching the floors. He was soft-spoken, a little chubby, and entirely overlooked. When the evacuation order came, he had stayed behind not out of a desire for glory, but because he had seen a group of terrified first-years getting lost near the grand staircase and had herded them into this side corridor for safety. Now that safety was gone. The lead Death Eater, a tall man whose mask had been half melted by a previous curse, stepped fully into the light. The air smelled of ozone and blood. "Well, look at this," the Death Eater sneered, his voice distorted. "A badger protecting the nest. Step aside, boy, and we might make it quick." Barnaby tried to push himself up, but his legs screamed in protest, sending white spots dancing across his vision. He collapsed back onto his elbows. The pain was a sharp, clarifying anchor. He did the math. 3 attackers.
Distance, 20 feet and closing. Behind him, 12 children who didn't know a shield charm from a sparkler. His own magical reserves were dangerously low. He had spent the last hour casting locking charms on every door in the wing. He gripped his wand, a rigid dogwood sequence that felt heavy in his sweating palm. "Stupefy!" Barnaby yelled, putting every ounce of his fear into the red jet of light. The Death Eater didn't even break stride. He flicked his wand lazily, and the red spell dissolved against a shimmering Protego shield, scattering harmlessly into sparks. The other 2 attackers laughed, a cruel, barking sound. They knew they had won. They began to advance, spreading out to block any escape. Flashback to 3 months ago. Barnaby was in the empty charms classroom, sweat dripping off his nose. He was trying to modify the standard levitation charm, but he kept getting the variables wrong.
He didn't want to lift the table. He wanted to make the table slide as if it weighed nothing. He wanted to remove the friction entirely. Professor Flitwick had walked in, observing the chaotic slide of a heavy oak desk across the room. It crashed into the wall with a deafening thud. "Mr. Finch," Flitwick had squeaked, not unkindly, "while your dedication to household maintenance is admirable, perhaps you should focus on your shield charms. War is coming, Barnaby. You cannot defeat a dark wizard by helping him rearrange his furniture." Barnaby had nodded, ashamed. He had shelved the spell. He called it the Glideway charm. His friends called it the Ice Rink Hex and used it to slide textbooks down the long tables in the Great Hall. It was a joke. Back in the corridor, the joke was about to die. The Death Eaters were 15 feet away now. The one on the left raised his wand, the tip glowing with a nasty purple light, a curse that would boil the blood in Barnaby's veins.
"Protego!" Barnaby gasped. A weak, wavering shield erupted in front of him. The purple curse smashed into it, shattering the barrier instantly and throwing Barnaby back against the hard wood of the tapestry room door. His head cracked against the frame. Blood trickled into his eye. He could hear the first years screaming behind the door. The sound cut through him sharper than any curse. "Finish him," the leader growled. "We have work to do." They broke into a run. It was a tactical error, born of arrogance. They wanted to close the gap, to enjoy the fear in his eyes before the end. They were charging down a stone corridor, their heavy dragonhide boots thumping rhythmically on the flagstones. 10 feet. Barnaby's vision blurred. He didn't aim at them. He couldn't penetrate their shields anyway. He aimed at the floor, specifically at the 10-foot stretch of stone directly between him and the charging killers.
If this forgotten legend of Hogwarts is already touching your heart and you'd like to keep these stories alive, you can support the channel by clicking the thanks button below the video. Every little bit helps me continue bringing you more hidden tales of courage and magic. Barnaby screamed the incantation, a guttural shout mixed with the agony of his broken leg. Lapsus totalis. The magic didn't look like much. A dull grey ripple washed over the stone floor, soaking into the granite. There was no flash, no bang. To the Death Eaters, it looked like a failed curse that had missed its target. They didn't slow down. The lead Death Eater's right boot hit the enchanted patch. Normally, when a foot strikes the ground, friction gives it purchase to push off for the next step. But Barnaby's spell didn't just make the floor slippery like ice, it removed friction from the equation entirely. It was a localized physics void. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The Death Eater's leg shot out forward as if he had been yanked by a grappling hook. Because he was running full tilt, his upper body was still travelling forward at speed, but his feet were suddenly travelling faster than his centre of gravity. He went horizontal in mid-air. His arms flailed, seeking balance that didn't exist. He smashed back first onto the stone with a sound like a wet sack of flour dropping from a tower. The two behind him tried to stop, but their momentum was already committed. They skidded onto the zone. One spun wildly, legs tangling, and crashed face first into the leader's stomach. The third, trying to jump over the pile, landed on the zone and simply kept sliding, uncontrollably, straight toward the wall. Because there was no friction to slow them down, they didn't stop sliding. They were human projectiles. Barnaby watched, breath hitched, as the third Death Eater slammed headfirst into the stone wall next to him with a sickening crunch. The man slumped, unconscious before he hit the ground. The other two were a tangle of limbs, sliding backwards now as the corridor had a slight, almost imperceptible downward slope. They were shouting, trying to scramble up, but every time they pushed against the floor to stand, their hands slipped out from under them. It was a nightmare of geometry. They couldn't anchor themselves to cast. They couldn't aim. "Damn you!" the leader roared, firing a curse wildly at the ceiling. Stone chips rained down. Barnaby knew the spell would only hold for seconds. The magic required immense concentration to maintain the friction void. His wand arm was trembling violently. He needed to secure them. He dragged himself upright, putting his weight on his good leg, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He pointed his wand at the heavy velvet tapestry above the sliding Death Eaters. It was an antique, thick and heavy, held up by a massive iron rod.
Depulso. He didn't hit the Death Eaters. He hit the iron brackets holding the tapestry. The metal groaned and sheared. The heavy tapestry, depicting a hunt in the Black Forest, collapsed. It fell like a weighted net, burying the two conscious Death Eaters underneath nearly 50 pounds of dusty velvet and iron. Barnaby didn't wait. He pointed his wand at the fabric. Duro. The transfiguration spell hit the velvet. The soft fabric instantly hardened into solid stone, trapping the Death Eaters beneath a rigid, contoured shell. They were pinned to the floor, encased in the very decoration of the castle they had come to destroy. Silence fell over the corridor. The only sound was the shallow breathing of the unconscious man against the wall and the muffled, panicked shouting from beneath the stone tapestry. Barnaby slumped. The adrenaline dumped out of his system all at once, leaving him cold and shaking. He slid down the doorframe, his broken leg throbbing with a renewed, white-hot intensity. The door behind him creaked open. A small face, pale and freckled, peeked out. A first-year Gryffindor girl. She looked at the devastation, the unconscious dark wizard, the stone mound trapping the others, the shattered wall. Then she looked at Barnaby, clutching his wand like a lifeline. Is it over?" she whispered. Barnaby looked at his wand, then at the useless cleaning spell that had just neutralized 3 murderers. He managed a weak, pain-filled smile. "For now," he rasped. "Stay inside. Don't come out until you hear Professor Sprout's voice." He didn't remember much after that. The pain overtook him, and the darkness of the corridor seemed to swallow him whole. He woke up hours later in the Great Hall, which had been converted into a triage centre. The air was thick with grief and relief in equal measure. Madame Pomfrey was fusing the bone in his leg, muttering about clean breaks and calcium potions. Nobody was celebrating Barnaby Finch.
Harry Potter had defeated the Dark Lord. The war was over. The heroes were being toasted in the centre of the hall. Barnaby was just another wounded student on a cot in the back row. But later that morning, as the sun broke over the ruined castle, Professor Flitwick came by. He looked tired, his clothes singed, a bandage around his head. He stopped at the foot of Barnaby's cot. He held something in his hand, a piece of the hardened tapestry, which had been chipped away to arrest the Death Eaters. "Minerva told me they found 3 high-ranking snatchers pinned in the east corridor," Flitwick said softly, "trapped by a hardened tapestry. But the auras were confused. They couldn't walk on the floor to get to them. They said it was unnaturally slick." Barnaby looked down at his hands. I didn't want them to get to the first years, Professor. It was the only spell I could think of, the furniture charm." Flitwick looked at the boy, really looked at him.
Perhaps for the first time in 7 years, he placed the stone fragment on the bedside table. A wizard uses the tools he has, Mr. Finch. You didn't just move furniture last night. You moved the line between life and death. 10 points to Hufflepuff. It was a small gesture. It wouldn't make the history books. Barnaby Finch would never be a famous aura. He would go on to run a successful magical maintenance business in Bristol. But for the 12 children who walked out of that alcove alive, and for the teachers who saw the aftermath of that corridor, the legend of the slippery Hufflepuff was as real as any duel fought by Dumbledore. It serves as a quiet reminder to us all. We often look for heroes in the thunder of great battles and the flash of complex duels. We underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who focus on the small things, the ones who fail their exams but never fail their friends. If this forgotten legend of Hogwarts touched your heart,
Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Barnaby's place? Like the video, share it with another Harry Potter fan, and subscribe to hear more hidden stories of courage, magic, and impossible odds. Sometimes the smallest spell is the one that saves the castle.